There is a place where a ship can sail from one ocean to another in a single day, without going around a continent, without crossing thousands of miles of open water. Just one narrow corridor of water, cut straight through solid land. On one side, the Atlantic. On the other, the Pacific. And between them, a country that was literally split in two so the world could move faster. This isn't just a canal. It's the moment humans forced a continent to open. And the story of how it happened is far stranger than the maps suggest. From above, Panama looks almost too thin to exist. A narrow strip of land bending between two oceans, in some places less than 50 miles wide. For most of human history, that geography was a wall. Ships sailing from New York to San Francisco had to travel roughly 14,000 miles around the entire continent of South America, through the storms of Cape Horn, one of the most dangerous waters on Earth. A single voyage could take months. Many ships never returned. And then, in 1914, that changed. A waterway opened across Panama that reduced that journey to less than 50 miles. Suddenly, the planet behaved differently. Trade routes shifted, distances collapsed, and one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever attempted became part of daily reality. But to understand what really happened here, you have to start where the story begins. Not with engineering, with the land itself. Chapter 1. The Thin Place. Panama was not always here. For most of Earth's history, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were connected. A wide gap of open water separated North and South America, and currents flowed freely between the two oceans. Then, roughly 3 million years ago, that gap closed. Tectonic activity pushed land upward from the seafloor. Slowly, a bridge formed, the Isthmus of Panama, a thin ribbon of land connecting two continents that had been separate for tens of millions of years. What happened next changed the planet. Ocean currents were forced to reorganize. Warm Atlantic water that had once flowed into the Pacific was redirected northward, helping shape what we now call the Gulf Stream. Climates shifted. Europe became warmer. Animals began crossing in both directions across the new land bridge, one of the largest natural migrations in the history of life on Earth. All of it made possible by this thin strip of land. And here is where the story turns, because the same geography that nature took millions of years to build, humans would later spend centuries trying to cut back open. Chapter 2. The Dream That Killed Thousands. The first to see the opportunity was Spain. In the early 1500s, Spanish explorers crossed the isthmus on foot, hauling gold and silver from the Pacific colonies to ships waiting in the Atlantic. The crossing took days, through dense jungle, through mosquito-thick swamps, through terrain that punished every step. But the logic was undeniable. If men could walk across this strip of land in a week, ships might one day cross it in hours. For 3 centuries, the idea remained a dream. Then, in 1881, the French arrived. Fresh from their triumph at the Suez Canal, they believed they could repeat the same feat in Panama. They were wrong. The conditions were unlike anything they had built in before. Suez had been carved through flat desert. Panama was the opposite. Mountains, rivers, rainforest, and rock. The terrain rose hundreds of feet above sea level. The Chagres River flooded violently with every storm. Landslides buried equipment. Machinery rusted in weeks. And then came the diseases: yellow fever, malaria. In the dense humidity of the jungle, mosquitoes bred in standing water everywhere, including the water tanks workers used to keep ants away from hospital beds. The hospitals themselves became sources of infection. By the time the French project collapsed in 1889, historians estimate that more than 20,000 workers had died. The company went bankrupt, investors lost fortunes, and the half-finished trench through Panama sat empty, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. It seemed the land had won, but the idea would not die, because the geography that made Panama so difficult also made it impossible to ignore. Chapter 3: The Birth of a Country. By the early 1900s, the United States had become the next great industrial power, and it wanted the canal. But there was a problem. Panama at that time was not an independent country. It was a province of Colombia, and Colombia refused to sign over the rights. What happened next is one of the most striking moments in modern political history. In November 1903, a small group of Panamanian leaders declared independence from Colombia. Within hours, U.S. warships appeared offshore. Colombian troops trying to reach the rebellion were blocked, and within days, the United States recognized Panama as a new nation and signed a treaty granting itself control over a 10-mile-wide strip of land across the country, the Canal Zone. A country had been created in part to make the canal possible. For the next several decades, the heart of Panama, the canal, and the land around it, strolled or would belong to a foreign power. That single fact would shape Panamanian identity for generations and eventually trigger the long negotiation that returned the canal to Panama in 1999. But that is a later chapter, because first, the canal had to be built, and the second attempt would change engineering forever. Chapter 4: Cutting Through the Mountain. The Americans arrived in 1904. They studied what the French had done. They studied what had killed them, and they made a different decision. Instead of trying to dig a sea-level canal through the mountains, the French plan, they would raise the ships up over the terrain using a system of locks. A ship would enter the canal at sea level, be lifted 85 feet above the oceans by a series of massive water chambers, cross the country at that elevation, and then be lowered back down on the other side. A staircase of water. To make it possible, they needed to do something even more ambitious. They needed to flood part of the country. The Chagres River, the same river that had destroyed the French effort with its floods, would be dammed. The water held back would form an artificial lake high above sea level. That lake would feed the canal. When it was completed, Gatun Lake was one of the largest artificial lakes in the world. Forests disappeared underwater. Villages were submerged. Hilltops became islands. But the hardest section was still ahead. Between the lake and the Pacific stood a mountain ridge. To make the canal work, engineers had to slice straight through it, through solid rock, for nearly 8 miles. This was the Culebra Cut, the place where the continent had to be physically forced open. The work consumed years. Dynamite tore through the rock day after day, with detonations heard for miles across the jungle. Steam shovels carved into the hillsides in long, layered terraces. Trains ran nearly non-stop, hauling spoil away from the cut. Hundreds of carloads every day, year after year. And the mountain fought back. Landslides were constant. Entire sections of hillside slid into the trench overnight, swallowing equipment, burying track, and undoing weeks of progress in a single collapse. Some slides were so massive they were never fully cleared. Engineers simply recut around them. Men worked in heat that climbed past 100 degrees, in mud after every rain, in dust thick enough to coat the lungs. At its deepest point, the cut descended more than 270 feet below the original surface of the ridge. By the time the canal opened, roughly 100 million cubic meters of earth and rock had been removed from this single section. Enough material, by some estimates, to build a wall 10 feet high around the planet. It was the largest excavation project in human history at the time. And it had cost thousands more lives, many of them West Indian laborers brought in from Jamaica and Barbados, workers whose names were rarely recorded and whose role in building one of the engineering wonders of the world has only recently begun to receive recognition. When the first ship passed through the Panama Canal on August 15, 1914, the world had changed. A continent had been cut in half, and the way goods moved across the planet would never be the same again. Chapter 5. The Life of the Canal. Most people imagine the canal as a single trench. It is not. The Panama Canal is a system, a 50-mile chain of locks, lakes, rivers, and artificial channels that work together to lift ships over a mountain range and lower them back down on the other side. A vessel entering from the Atlantic begins at the Gatun Locks. 3 chambers, each large enough to hold a small skyscraper laid on its side, raise the ship 85 feet in stages. Each chamber fills with millions of gallons of fresh water, water that comes entirely from Gatun Lake, fed by rainfall in the surrounding rainforest. No pumps lift the water, gravity does. When a lock fills, water flows down from the lake above. When it empties, water flows out toward the ocean. The entire system runs on a principle that has not changed in over a century. Control the water and the ships move themselves. Once raised, a vessel crosses Gatun Lake, navigating between forested islands that were once hilltops. Then it enters the Culebra Cut, now called the Gatun Cut, passing through walls of rock that still bear the scars of the original excavation. On the Pacific side, the descent begins. Pedro Miguel Lock lowers the ship 1 level. Then the Miraflores locks complete the drop to sea level. The whole crossing takes between 8 and 10 hours for a ship that would otherwise need a month at sea. Today, around 13,000 to 14,000 vessels pass through the canal every year. Tankers, container ships, cruise liners, each one paying a toll that can reach several $100,000 for a single crossing. And in some auctions for priority passage, far more. But the canal that exists today is not the canal that opened in 1914. In 2016, after nearly a decade of construction, Panama completed a massive expansion. A new set of locks, the Agua Clara locks on the Atlantic side and the Cocoli locks on the Pacific, was added to handle a new generation of larger ships. Vessels that had previously been too wide to cross now could. The category even has a name, Neo-Panamax. Ships built specifically to fit the new locks, and with that expansion, Panama roughly doubled its capacity. Chapter 6. What water gave, water can take. But here, the story turns, because the canal has a weakness most people never think about. It is not the locks, it is not the gates, it is not the rock, it is the water itself. The Panama Canal does not use seawater. It uses freshwater, rainwater collected in Gatun Lake and the surrounding watershed. Every time a ship transits the locks, roughly 50 million gallons of freshwater are released, drawn from the lake, used once, and flushed out to sea. Gatun Lake is not scenery. It is the fuel tank. For most of the canal's history, that fuel tank refilled itself. Panama receives some of the heaviest rainfall in the Western Hemisphere, and the surrounding rainforest acted as a vast natural reservoir. Trees holding the rain, soil releasing it slowly, the lake rising back to operational levels with every wet season. That balance is the quiet logic of the entire system. Rainforest feeds rainfall. Rainfall feeds the lake. The lake feeds the locks. The locks move the world. But in recent years, that chain has begun to strain. Rainfall patterns have become less predictable. Severe droughts in 2019 and again in 2023 lowered water levels in Gatun Lake to some of the worst on record. And the canal responded the only way it could. It slowed down. In the worst stretches, Panama reduced the number of ships allowed to cross each day by nearly half. Vessels queued offshore for days. Some waited weeks. Others gave up entirely and rerouted around South America. Back to the same Cape Horn passage the canal was built to eliminate. Shipping costs climbed. Auction prices for priority slots soared, with some single transits reportedly selling for several $million. Supply chains stretching from Asia to the US East Coast had to be redrawn in real time. A canal built to defeat geography had been slowed by the sky. And the implications go beyond shipping, because the same lake that feeds the locks also supplies drinking water to a large share of the Panamanian population. When the canal needs water, the country needs water. When rainfall drops, both compete. Panama is now studying long-term solutions, new reservoirs, water recycling systems within the locks, even projects that would pump water back uphill from lower elevations. But none of these are simple, and none of them are fast. The canal that cut a continent in half now depends on the rain that falls above it. Chapter 7. The choke point that moves the world step back, and the scale of what passes through this corridor becomes hard to grasp. Roughly 5% of global maritime trade moves through the Panama Canal. Grain from the American Midwest bound for Asia. Liquefied natural gas from the Gulf Coast. Cars from Japan and South Korea headed to the US East Coast. Container ships running between Shanghai, Singapore, New York, and Savannah. A ship that uses the canal saves not just time, but fuel, crew costs, insurance, and entire weeks of exposure to rough open ocean. For a vessel running between Asia and the US East Coast, the canal can cut the voyage by thousands of miles. For one running between New York and California, it eliminates an entire detour around a continent. That is the quiet power of a choke point, a strip of water, barely wider than the ships that cross it, that decides the price of goods on shelves thousands of miles away. For most of the 20th century, that choke point was controlled by the United States. The canal zone operated as an American territory cutting straight through a sovereign country. A situation that became increasingly untenable and increasingly unpopular as the decades passed. In 1977, 2 treaties were signed that would transfer the canal to Panama in stages. On December 31st, 1999, the handover was complete. For the first time since it opened, the Panama Canal was fully Panamanian. Today, it is run by the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous agency that operates the canal as both a national asset and a global utility. The revenue is enormous. Canal tolls are one of the largest sources of income for the Panamanian state, funding schools, infrastructure, and public services across the country. The canal does not just pass through Panama, it powers it. And that gives the country a position that few small nations ever achieve. When the canal slows down, the world feels it. Container rates rise, delivery schedules shift, ports on 3 continents adjust, companies reroute, restock, reprice, and every time a drought lowers Gatun Lake by another foot, traders, shippers, and governments watch the rainfall numbers in Panama the way others watch oil prices. A narrow strip of water, cut through a thin strip of land, still deciding how the world moves. Panama is often described in numbers: 50 miles wide, 85 feet above sea level, roughly 13,000 ships a year, 100 million cubic meters of earth removed. But numbers do not capture what really happened here. A wall of land that nature spent millions of years building, cut open by hand, by dynamite, by steam, and paid for in disease and loss. A staircase of water lifting ships over a mountain range. A lake that is also a fuel tank. A rainforest that is also infrastructure. A shortcut that the entire world quietly depends on, and that still answers in the end to the sky. The canal is not just a piece of engineering. It is the most visible scar left by an idea that geography could be defeated. For more than a century, it has been. But every drought is a reminder that the defeat was never total. That a continent cut in half is still a continent. That the rain still has a vote. This is Panama, cut in half, holding the planet together.